Welcome all to the seminar where Jonatan from Gothenburg, Sweden will tell us something about game development. Please welcome Jonatan.
I've made a lot of games, and a lot of these games have been made in a matter of hours instead of days or weeks or months. And I'm going to talk about how you make a game in a really short period of time instead of wasting a lot of time making the game. I'm known as Cactus on the internet. So now I'm going to talk about why you want to make a game in a day or two instead of spending a lot of time on it. And I'm going to do this by comparing making games to making babies. And you start with the good part, which is the conception, or when you get the idea. And I think many people think getting ideas is more fun and enjoyable than actually making the games. And you get to play around a lot. You can think of new things, and you can try these out. And once you have an idea, you have these really high expectations of how your game is going to end up like. It's often you think it's going to be really cool, and you can't wait to see it finished. But then you realize it's a lot harder than you thought. You actually have to put a lot of work into it. And there are a lot of unexpected problems, like gaining weight, because you're sitting in front of the computer all the time, and you don't get enough exercise. And it requires a lot of energy to keep at it, and there are a lot of distractions that can easily get you off track. And you also start feeling isolated because you can't go out as much as you used to before. So you get tired of it, and it just takes too much effort, and you're not really sure what you need to do to get it finished, but you have these kind of goals that you have to meet somehow. And maybe you don't want to do it anymore. You can think of a lot of things that you maybe would rather try to do. You get new ideas, maybe this game would be better than the one I'm working at. And you don't get much respect when you sit in front of the computer all the time, getting fatter slowly, so people don't give you much respect. And they think you're just sitting there in front of the computer playing around, not really doing anything important. And obviously you're not taking care of yourself, you're not getting enough sun, you're maybe eating too much, maybe just not socializing. And then there's the part that's the most painful, which is actually finishing the game. When you have the game almost complete and you have like 10% left, and all there is left is polish and making sure everything actually works and that users will be able to play it. And yeah, that's no fun. And when you're finally finished and it's actually done, sometimes it's not exactly what you expected it to be in the beginning, and maybe it wasn't actually worth the whole process of making it. And then again, sometimes it turns out even better than you thought it would be, so it can be worth it. So yeah, here's a bit about creativity. It's always good to experiment a lot. You can come up with really cool things if you just try to think of a lot of ideas and see what you can do with them. And it's really cool when people actually try to make a game that doesn't rely on humor or action to be interesting. And if your concept starts dragging on, you've used the same thing in every level, maybe you should try to think of something new that will actually rejuvenate the game. And yeah, the game doesn't need to be fun. You can make games that are scary or interesting or just gives you a certain feeling. It doesn't have to be a lot of fun to play. And it's quite important to create a good atmosphere regardless of what kind of game you're making. If it's an action game, make it really action-filled, and if it's a quiet game, make it serene or something like that. So here I tried to make a game that does something unexpected. So yeah, the explosions in this game turn solid instead of... And then you add a new element to make it a little bit more interesting. Yeah. And finally you can add another element if those two elements aren't enough. So you have to collect all the stuff before you can exit the screen. Okay, now I'm going to talk about how you can do graphics in short amounts of time. And here are some of the methods I'm going to describe here. And these all work really well, and they can actually look really good if you put your heart into it. So yeah, here's the doodle, which is just you playing around with the mouse in a really basic tool like MS Paint or something like that. And it doesn't really look good when it's not moving, but if you add some animation, it starts looking a bit more interesting. And you can make it walk or whatever you want to do. And it doesn't take a lot of time since the individual frames aren't that important. It's just important that you get across what's actually going on. And then this is how it looks in action. And they actually look pretty decent. So that's one way of doing it. Here's another way, which is you just draw basic outlines, and it doesn't take a lot of time or effort. You just need to know what looks kind of decent. Then you can just write a really simple script to piece them together. And once you got that script, you can just write an easy script to make it move. And it actually looks pretty good. And you can easily add a lot of variations once you had the scripts ready. So you just need to change the individual pieces. And here's the pixelated version, which doesn't look like much, but you can animate it. And since it's so small, it's a lot easier to make the animation a lot more fluid. And it doesn't take a lot of time either. And it looks a lot better when you blow it up a bit, because then you can see all the details. And you can also add colors to make it more interesting. And once you have that, you can actually just use that sprite to make many sprites. And they look slightly different, but since there's different colors and different proportions, it actually looks kind of good. And then we have the using shapes, like in some new games that use kind of retro graphics use this. And the biggest mistake with using this is having too saturated colors. This doesn't look good at all. So you have to desaturate it a bit so it looks less hurtful to the eyes. And then you can rotate it a bit so it looks a little bit more advanced than just basic squares. And you can make them blink and twitch a bit, so that gives sort of an impression that they're actually real things and not just shapes. And you can add some kind of atmosphere to make it look a little bit more interesting. And maybe you can add an effect like rain, which makes it look like maybe there's something there that I don't see, or a cooler rain effect maybe. And here's another one that is just using an image without actually animating it, but just moving pieces around from it. So it looks kind of interesting, at least. You can do a lot of things with graphics that no one has done before. Yeah, this is just one sprite that you just chop up a bit. And backgrounds, you can draw them and scale them and use different resolutions to create interesting effects. So this looks a bit better in motion. And then you add the cowboy and it looks well, sort of interesting. Yeah, that was what this whole thing was about. And here's some more things, like when you have levels and you use tiles. maybe you don't want to draw a lot of tiles, so use just a basic one. And this looks kind of stale and boring. So you try to make it look more interesting. Maybe you make the tiles flicker a bit. Or you could make them change color a bit also. And maybe you add some cool effect that looks like you put some effort into it. Or you could just make them shake and rotate slightly, which makes the level look a lot more alive. So yeah, this is actually supposed to be gameplay. I don't know why it said graphics. And here's an example where the gameplay is kind of boring because it takes way too much time to actually make something happen. The enemies are too hard to kill. And here's a more obvious example where the enemies take a lot of hits, and it's not a lot of fun to play a game that takes this much effort to kill an enemy. And here's a more interesting version of the first one. Yeah, you make it a little bit more hectic and more active visually, so it looks a lot more interesting. And here's some really important things to do before you start making a game, especially if you want to make it in a short period of time. You need to go to the bathroom before you start working on anything, because if you're feeling like you need to go to the bathroom, your game is going to turn out like shit. It's not going to turn into a good game, especially not if you need to shit. And it's important to eat and drink. Whenever I feel like, hey, I don't want to make this game anymore, often it's just that I'm hungry or thirsty and I'm losing my energy. So yeah, it's really important to eat and drink. But you shouldn't eat too much, because that will make you feel bloated and maybe it will make you want to go to the bathroom again. And it's really important to have an idea ready before you start working on something. It's really difficult to force an idea out and just sit in front of the computer and try to make this game happen when you don't really know what it's going to be about. So don't do that. And it's really important to have the right tools. You can't just think, I'm going to learn some really difficult language like C++ and make a really cool game. It's better to start with something that you actually know how to use. And if you don't know how to use a game, don't try to make a game in less than a day. It's not going to happen. And whenever you can, save some time. You don't always have to do the complicated way, even if the results get slightly better. Often simple graphics can look more interesting than complex graphics, and same with gameplay mechanics. You don't have to make a really complex game to make it fun or cool to play. So yeah, audio is actually a really important aspect to games. A game with really good audio can actually be better than a game with really good graphics and crappy audio. And yeah, music is important, and so is sound effects. And the best tool I've ever used for sound effects is this. It's called SFXR. And it's more targeted at retro games than modern games. But you can just click any of these buttons to make a randomly generated sound that actually sounds really good. You can make a ton of explosions. You don't have to use one explosion sound. You can just do how many you want. And it's free to download, and it's really, really easy to use. And also there are a lot of musicians out there who put their work up for free to download. And since most of them don't use vocals, it's a really good source of getting music for your games. And I've often stolen music from websites and just put some credit on there because I release most of my games free, so I don't feel like I'm actually exploiting them or anything like that. But whenever they have found out that I've used their music, they are usually really nice about it and like, oh, this is awesome. I really wanted to see my music in a game. And if you want to use it for commercial purposes, they're often really nice about it, so you can just talk to them about that. So yeah, that's the lecture I had, but I have some games I can show you if you want that were made in really short periods of time. This is one of the games I've made, and it was made in 4 hours, I think. And yeah, I just stole the music from this really cool guy, and I talked to him later, and he was really happy about it. So, and here, you can't actually shoot or harm the enemies. You have to use the enemies' projectiles to make them kill each other. And then you can pick up stuff that they leave behind to get more defense against the enemy's shots. Yeah, I'm pretty happy about the results for this game. It's a pretty good prototype. Maybe it could be used for something bigger. This one a Dutch friend of mine did in 2 hours, I think. Really simple graphics and music, and it still looks quite interesting in my opinion. And it's pretty fun to play also. Here's a pretty interesting, or at least good-looking version of Snake. And it was made in 3 hours, I think. And it's actually quite fun to play and sort of interesting twist on the whole thing. And yeah, I like the graphics. It's very simple but interesting. yeah, this game is all about figuring out all the things you can do in the game. So it's sort of inspired by a game called I Wish I Were the Moon. Oh. It's a little bit difficult. So yeah, there's 5 endings to unlock that you have to figure out all the different things you can do, and it's not as easy as it sounds. And here's another game that has quite an interesting graphical style, I think, and it was made in a day or two, I think. And this guy hadn't even made that many games before, like 2 games probably. And it sort of tries to look like a VHS videotape. And you have to use the shields to protect yourself while aiming at the same time. And it's a little bit difficult. Yeah, normally I get killed way easier than this, but yeah, it's a cool game. This game is really cool. It was made also in just 3 hours for a competition. that's how you beat the game. Let's see. Yeah, this one barely has any graphics at all. Yeah, it's pretty good for a game made in 2 hours. And here's another game I made in 3 hours. It's actually not finished though, but it shows that you can try out a pretty interesting idea. Yeah, but it's quite interesting what you can do in 3 hours.